I'm Aaron Weintraub, and this is Inside Kurdistan. So this lead-in music is different because our wonderful guest today, Boran Zaza, kindly provided it. This whole episode will come with more examples of some of her performances, and she's a wonderful pianist, so I'd just like to thank her up front for providing it. It's a real treat. This is another episode where I don't have much to say for a lead-in because I'm not a musician and I don't have any background in musicology, so I'm just going to speak briefly about Boran. As I said, she's a concert pianist, now based out of Toronto, Canada, but originally from Syria, who has dedicated a significant portion of her career towards capturing Kurdish music through classic piano performance, which traditionally caters to a more Western audience. And one of the things I found interesting when we spoke before was that she said that she only got invested in Kurdish music once she moved to Canada. We talk a lot about the differences between Western classic music and music from the region, as well as what sets Kurdish music apart from other kinds of music in the surrounding area. And she was kind enough to provide music samples to show me and you exactly how and why different forms of music sound distinct from one another, and where she believes the mixing of Kurdish composition with Western classic music is going next. So if you're passionate about how music is made, this is the episode for you. So without any further ado, here's me and Boran. Boran Zaza, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Aaron. It's really a pleasure to be here today.
So I wanted to start because you come from a musical family, and your father in particular is somewhat of a prominent figure in the Syrian musical community, although not necessarily specifically just for composition. I was wondering if we could get into a little more about your family's background, and then we can go into your background as well.
Yes, absolutely. So my dad is Dr. Mohammed Aziz Zaza. So he is indeed, as you said, a prominent musical figure in Kurdish Syria and in Iraq and in the Middle East as a whole. He was one of the very first people from the Middle East to get a doctorate in musicology, the science in music. He went to study music after having started in Syria and playing some Kurdish music, Armenian music, Oriental music in general, on different instruments like violin, oud, jumbush, etc. After that, he moved to Prague in the Czech Republic, a place that I actually just got to visit a couple of months ago. And I was really impressed to see how he went all the way from that part of the world and integrated into a new society, different language, different culture. And he started studying there in the music conservatory, and he studied guitar and composition because the teachers there found that his background in improvising would make him a very good candidate to study composition, and also the fact that he played instruments like jumbush would be close to guitar. So that was sort of his musical background. He continued his studies there. He stayed there for 14 years in Prague. He did a bachelor, master, and doctorate in musicology there, performed a lot of concerts, brought actually the Kurdish music there as well with him. And after that, he moved back to the Middle East. And this is where my family history has a lot of moving around. So I was conceived in Algeria and spent the first 5 years of my life in Libya because my father, he started the Department of Music in the university in Algeria. Then the civil war started there, so he had to move from there. He moved to Libya. He taught music there at university as well. And then he wanted to bring back all the knowledge that he had to where he grew up in Qamishlo in Syria. So we moved back there as a family, and he started a music institute. And he taught a lot of musicians there who went on to do great things, be it in Kurdish music or just in classical composition as well. And then in 2003, he was offered to start a music school in Erbil in Kurdistan. And that was when we also, again, as a family, moved there. That was also at the time where I realized that I personally wanted to do music for the rest of my life. So I started to study music there, and we will probably get into that in a bit. But yeah, my father, he was definitely very influential in first making me aware of what it's like to have a career as a musician, something that was quite unusual in that part of the world, especially for a woman. I don't think if I had any other dad that I would have been encouraged to do what I wanted to do. So I was very lucky in that way.
And so you have also have a background in musicology, but you have focused on piano as your main instrument. Could you tell me a little more about your own development, and also how old were you when you first got into music in Erbil?
So I think there's twofold into this story. So there's when I started to study music with my father, and it was mostly studying music theory, solfeggio, just understanding how music works, how the theory behind it works. I was not a fan of the guitar, which was my dad's main instrument. And it's something he always tells me is like, if only you would have chosen to play the guitar, I would have been able to help you so much. But I saw piano on TV at some point in my life, and I thought, that's the king of instruments. That's what I want to play. When we lived in Syria, the situation was hard, and we lived in a city where there were literally no pianos or piano teachers, so it was impossible to start that back then. But then when we moved to Erbil, that was when it seemed like there was hope for me to pursue what I wanted. So I enrolled in the Institute of Fine Arts in Erbil. I was 15 years old at the time, which is actually considered to be very late for someone to start studying piano if you want to get into a professional level. But I was lucky. I was well surrounded. I was very passionate about it. I practiced so much, maybe 8 hours a day, every day for a few years. So I managed to catch up. After that, I had a bit of a traumatizing experience. So I auditioned for a music school in Turkey. I was rejected, but like a sort of a very, very harsh rejection, the kind of rejection where you're told, what are you even doing with your life? You're really behind. You really should do something else. And that was when I stopped playing piano for a whole year and moved to Lebanon, and I started to study musicology because I thought, okay, maybe I need to find a different relationship with music. And so when you're studying musicology, you still learn your instrument, but it's not the main focus. Your main focus is to study the music theory. And actually, that was really fantastic because in Lebanon, there is a great methodology of teaching not only classical music, but also of teaching theory of Oriental music, Lebanese music, Armenian music. So that really contributed to my growth as a musician as a whole. And after that, I got back into playing piano, thanks to a teacher who heard me practicing in a practice room and told me, oh, you should pursue this. So, it's just a story of some people in certain points in your life can make or break you in a way, when you're still trying to find your way. And that teacher really helped me just realize that if it's something that I want to do, then I don't need to wait for someone to tell me that I'm able to do it, and I need to just pursue it and do it. So that was how I got back into playing piano. And then after I finished my studies in musicology in Lebanon, I applied for universities around the world and ended up studying more piano at McGill University, which is one of the finest music schools in North America. So, just different moments in my life where I had doubts about being a pianist, being a musician, but always kept that relationship one way or another with music.
I think, and since you have this background in musicology, I'd actually like to ask about, I think generally, why don't we start with talking about regional music, Oriental music, and compare it to, I guess, what we could call Western classic music. And I was wondering if you could break down, in really the most basic terms possible for people like me who don't have a classic music background, could you break down what kind of differences there are in composition between these two styles of music?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the 16th century, Western classical music had something that defined how classical music was composed for the years after that, which was equal temperament, which means it's a tuning system in which an octave, so the 7 notes, the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, are divided into 12 semitones of an equal size. So this is something that allowed Western classical music to have harmony, which is putting one note above another, and making different chords. While in Oriental music, the music is very melodic. It doesn't go by octaves, but rather uses different modes. And each mode is around 3 to 4 notes. There is one mode that is also 5 notes. So it's going in much smaller intervals that are then put next to each other. And we use quarter notes in the Oriental music. So I think that's like the main difference that just made those different types of music go different ways, which is why in classical music you have harmony, counterpoint, while Oriental music is much more melodic.
And you've given us a recorded example of the difference between scales and modes, so I'm going to go ahead and play that now.
So each maqam is made up of what we call ragaz. 2 of them in each maqam. We call it ragaz in Kurdish and jins in Arabic. So ragaz, we have quite a few of them. You've probably heard about some of them. Hijaz, Bayat, Saba, Nahawand. Each ragaz is made up of 4 notes for the most part. For example, we have the Nahawand. It sounds a lot like the Western minor scale. There is one ragaz that is made up of 5 notes, and we call it negriz. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 notes. While in Nahawand we had 4 notes. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Thanks for that. What other differences are there?
There's also a difference in terms of the rhythms. So Oriental music being something that is melodic and somehow more simply composed, if we look at textures, as a result, if we look into the rhythms, they are much more complex. So I think it depends if we're looking at the music sort of horizontally or vertically when we're comparing Western classical music and Oriental music. So Western music is something that would look more into vertically, with a lot of notes being played at the same time, while Oriental music would be something we look at horizontally. So a melody with oftentimes a complex rhythm.
You've also given me here a pre-recording that puts these rhythmic differences on display a little better, so I'm going to go ahead and play that as well.
We can think about the Western classical music in terms of something that is more vertical, because we have chords that are constructed of a few notes that together make harmony. So for example, this is much more common sound in Western classical music, while in Oriental music, in Kurdish music, we would hear something much more melodic. So we think about it much more vertically instead of horizontally. So it would sound something like this. Now the beauty is when we break down the harmony of classical music and add to it the melodies of Kurdish music, then you end up with something like this.
There's also what was the role of music in the lives of people, So for example, if we talk about music from even in mid-Asia, or about Kurdish music, or in different places, a big function of it was storytelling and making sure that the culture gets passed down from generation to generation. While in the Western classical music, it was very, very religious. It evolved a lot in the church. So it served a different function. And of course, over the years, because of that fundamental difference of the tuning system, each music, of course, went in a different direction.
And I think personally speaking, like with my own background with Oriental music, which is admittedly, again, very limited, but I think it's representative of a lot of people's grasp of music here. It comes from Turkish orchestras, and Turkish music and Kurdish music are geographically so intertwined. I was wondering if you could give me some insight on how classic Kurdish music borrows and is borrowed from Turkish music specifically.
Yeah, I think there would be a lot of debate about that one on who borrowed from whom.
Yes.
I think we need to recognize that the music in the Middle East in general, it's very close to one another. I was talking about this yesterday to my father actually, and we had this example of hummus, for example, this very delicious plate that every nationality, like you go to someone Palestinian or Syrian or Lebanese, and they would swear to you that it comes from them. I think at some point there is a beauty of this sort of the mix of cultures. Mm-hmm. And for me personally, yes, there is something that's very distinct about Kurdish music. Was it borrowed from other cultures? Was it? I wouldn't call it that. I would call it just that because geographically they were close, there was just an exchange, I would say, of culture. But if we look more, if we zoom in more into what is actually different, there is something unique about the instruments that Kurdish music uses that is not used in other cultures. For example, you have the zurna, the dahol, the blur, the tambur. Those are really specific to Kurdish music and Kurdish culture. So when you're listening to music and you hear those instruments, then you can be sure that this is Kurdish music. There's also a difference in terms of what kind of modes are being used, which we talked about earlier. So those sort of four notes next to each other, what they are and how they modulate from one mode to a different mode. So again, I think at first it might sound the same, but it's actually there are subtle differences, and each culture uses certain modes much more than others. So for example, in Kurdish, you would use the bayat. This is like really instrumental, if I may say, in Kurdish music. And in terms of rhythm, the Georgina rhythm is very present in Kurdish music. So I think, yes, they are very close. There might be a lot of things that are similar in the compositional styles, but there are also some subtle differences that can make us distinguish where they come from. And even within Kurdish music, you have the more Sorani culture and you have the more Badini culture. And even within those, you have differences in what they sound like and what kind of modes they will use and how they will modulate and what kind of text will be with it. One thing I can say for sure about Kurdish music is that vocal music is very prominent and very important, and instruments are secondary. And I think that what happened with Turkish music and the way it evolved over the years, and with the rise of a lot of Turkish people having access to a quality music education, and also being inspired by the Western classical music, they were able to really go far in developing the instrumental part of that. And I think that's where Kurdish music is drawing inspiration from the Turkish experience.
And something you mentioned earlier was the tradition of storytelling. And so there are different themes and tropes to pay attention to, I think, in any culture's music. I was wondering if you could give me some of the different feelings that come up frequently in Kurdish music.
I would say that the feeling that comes up the most, and it just defines the culture, the Kurdish culture generally, is melancholy. That is a theme that is really present in any type of Kurdish music, or even with the Chirok Bej, the storytellers. But there is also the very festive part, which is all of the wedding music kind of thing, the festive music that we have Kurdish dances that go along with it. So I would say, yeah, absolutely, melancholy is the number one mood in both the way the music is composed and in the types of lyrics that go as well with the music. Secondary to that as well, there is just this aspect of passing on the knowledge from generation to generation. So there are songs about work, there are songs about different seasons, etc.
And you also mentioned, actually, when we spoke before, about how specifically Kurdish music has a link to harvest.
Yes, absolutely. So you had, people, and I think this was much more prominent as well in the Sorani music. So you have all of those songs that were being sung while people were harvesting as well.
When we talk about melancholy, it's interesting because when we're talking about like specifically a diasporic population and the importance of passing along stories, I was wondering when you first got into Kurdish music, when you were abroad in Canada, do you think that you embraced that more when you were farther away from the region?
Absolutely. I think this is a very true observation from your end. I remember when I was living in Kurdistan, in Erbil, I took Kurdish music for granted because it was played everywhere around me. I didn't even realize that I was listening to it, even though I wasn't actively listening to it. So, be it in the restaurant or in the cab going somewhere, or even at school, or just in a gathering at home where just we'd have some singers come over and my dad would play and they would sing. When I moved here, I suddenly realized how deprived I was of all of that, and that it was something that did mean something to me. And there was also the question of trying to define who I am and what difference or what else do I bring to the conversation when it comes to music and classical music and just being a musician in general. As a classical pianist, I mean, let's face it, there were so many other pianists that were so much better than me here, who have had access to a great education since they were kids. They've done all the competitions, they've done all the summer academies, and it was something that I just simply never had access to do. So I started to look to something that would distinguish my voice as an artist. And that was when I started to be more interested in Oriental music in general, but in Kurdish music specifically. I realized that the fact that it's so natural to me is actually something really unique and powerful. And that was when I started to integrate more Kurdish music into my repertoire. And I must say that it was a bit of something that's not easy to do, given the fact that I'm a pianist. Piano is one instrument where it uses the equal temperament tuning system, and all the music is written with harmony usually. So it was really difficult to translate that very melodic, rhythmically complex Kurdish music into the piano. But what is wonderful is that nowadays we have very talented Kurdish musicians who studied in great music schools abroad, who were able to actually translate that music. Myself, I am not a composer, I am a performer. So it's really wonderful that right now there are composers out there who do translate that music into something that sounds really beautiful on the piano. So recently for Newroz, I recorded a song that is called Newroz by Hassan Zirak, which was transcribed for piano by Brahim Shekho, which was actually a student of my father back when we lived in Qamishlo in Syria. And after that, he went on to study composition in Germany and publish a book called A Selection of Kurdish Songs for Piano. And that was the one that I recorded. So, somehow it all came
it comes full
around
circle.
in a certain full circle.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I was really happy about the reception of that performance, because I think Kurdish people are ready to hear music that is more sort of relaxing on the piano, for example, just something that is with the change of lifestyle as well, that has become, let's admit it, a bit more westernized. I think the idea of having some piano music at the end of the day is something that is more and more appealing for people.
So there is now a greater influence of Kurdish musicians and composers internationally due to this diasporic element in the community. Do you think this element has inspired more Kurdish-focused composition internationally in the more recent generation?
I think that there is definitely a rise, and I think where the rise is not quite balanced yet is that we have the composers but not necessarily the performers. For example, I know that Brahim Shekho's music has been mostly performed by fantastic musicians in Germany, but there's something missing, like they're playing the right note at the right time, but there's something missing. And I think that comes from just being brought up in a different culture and having that connection that melancholy that exists in Kurdish music, to that pain that has been passed down from generation to generation. So I think that the rise of compositions is fantastic. And I think that more and more young Kurdish people are having access to music education, which is great. And I think that through this, Kurdish music has a chance to become more international. I think that if I would play Newroz by Hassan Zirak to a Canadian person, like original version recording from, tens of years ago, that would be way too much of a cultural shock. But if I lure them in with a recording of that song on the piano, an instrument that they know and they've always heard, from there, they might be ready to listen to that original version.
You can
so
fool
I think
them.
it's just about, easing people into that.
Yeah. Well, and with that, I was wondering, what are you hoping to do with your own performances, with just in general with Kurdish music, but also just in general, like how are you hoping to develop your craft in the future?
So one project that I am still I'm still thinking about it, about the logistics of how to do it. But I would really love to record a CD of Kurdish music on the piano. It's something that does not exist yet, to my knowledge. And I think that the future of Kurdish music would not be just by me going and performing once in front of a smaller group of people, but rather if it's recorded and then a lot of more people have access to it, then that's something that would make a much bigger impact, I think, and get Kurdish music heard. And one other thing as well I'm passionate about is coupling music with a beautiful visual as well. So making sure that there is a nice video as well that goes with that, something that conveys other elements of the Kurdish culture. So I think, my projects are probably a bit more interdisciplinary, more recording, something that would stay for years to come, and then that's more accessible for a lot of people.
Well, Boran Zaza, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Aaron. This has been a very pleasant conversation, and thank you so much for shedding light on Kurdish music.
Thank you, Boran Zaza, for talking with me and sharing your music with me as well. And thanks to our audience for listening in. I have included a link to Boran's website in the description below if you want to check out any more of her work, which I would thoroughly recommend. Inside Kurdistan is brought to you by the Kurdistan Information Network, and you can visit us at kurdistanin.net. Be sure to follow us on Apple or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you have any questions or comments on this episode or any other episode, be sure to reach out to us at info@kurdistanin.net. I've been Aaron Weintraub, and this has been Inside Kurdistan.